History often feels like a story written by the winners, a tale of inevitable tides where massive empires expand, swallowing everything in their path until the map is painted in a single colour. By the late 15th century, that tide was the Ottoman Empire. After the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the shadow of the Sultan stretched long over Europe, and to the kings and emperors of the West, it looked unstoppable. But history is stubborn. Sometimes the tide hits a rock it cannot wash away. In the jagged borderlands of Eastern Europe, tucked between the Carpathian Mountains and the Black Sea, lay the small principality of Moldova. By all rights, it should have been just another stepping stone for the Ottoman armies marching towards Central Europe. It was neither a rich empire nor a military superpower. Yet, in the winter of 1473, a decision was made in a stone fortress in the north of this small country that would freeze that tide, at least for a moment. The man who made the decision was Stephen III, known to his people as the Voivode. In the language of the region, Voivode meant a warlord prince, a ruler whose authority came from his ability to command an army. This wasn't a choice made out of naive optimism. It was a calculated gamble by a man who had spent his entire life watching thrones topple and families murder one another for power. We need to look at the world as Stephen saw it in the 1470s. For nearly 2 decades, the Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II, had been reshaping the map. He viewed himself not just as a king, but as the heir to the Caesars, the king of the world. His armies were professional, equipped with massive cannons that had shattered the legendary walls of Byzantium. To the small Christian states in the Balkans, the Sultan offered a simple choice: submission or destruction. Submission usually meant paying tribute. This was protection money. You sent bags of gold to the Ottoman government in Constantinople, and in exchange the Ottoman armies didn't burn your villages or enslave your children. For years, Moldova had paid. It was the price of survival. But Stephen was not a man built for submission. His bloodline tells us why. He was a member of the House of Musat, a dynasty that had clawed Moldova into existence. But his rise to power hadn't been a smooth inheritance. It was born in blood. Stephen's father, Bogdan II, had been assassinated by his own brother at a wedding feast. Stephen, just a teenager at the time, had been forced to flee into exile. He spent his youth as a refugee, moving between the courts of Transylvania and Wallachia, learning the art of war and the bitter taste of betrayal. He learned that in the Balkans, power wasn't given, it was seized. When he finally took his throne back in 1457, leading an army to defeat his father's murderer, he didn't sit comfortably. He knew that a ruler who looked weak was a dead ruler. The chroniclers of the time give us a complicated picture of him. They don't paint him as a gentle saint. One Moldovan writer, Miron Kostin, described him as irascible, cruel, and prone to shed innocent blood. He was known to order executions during meals without a formal trial. It sounds horrific to modern ears, but in the 15th century this reputation for ruthlessness was a political asset. It meant he was strong, it meant he was in control, and for a country surrounded by wolves, Hungary to the west, Poland to the north, and the Ottomans to the south, a ruthless leader was the only kind that mattered. The trigger for the conflict wasn't just religion or pride, it was economics. Moldova sat on a piece of real estate that was incredibly valuable. It controlled the Moldovan Road. This was a network of trade routes that linked the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. Merchants carrying furs, amber and spices moved between the Polish city of Lvov and the Moldovan ports of Chilia and Setatea Alba on the coast. These ports were the lungs of the Moldovan economy. They were the gateways that connected northern Europe to the riches of the east. Whoever controlled the mouths of the Danube and the Dniester rivers controlled the flow of money. Sultan Mehmed II knew this. He called the Black Sea a Turkish lake. He wanted total control over the trade routes. If he could take the Moldovan ports, he could strangle the economy of Poland and Hungary and force them to their knees. Stephen saw the noose tightening. He knew that paying tribute bought him time, but it didn't buy him safety. The Ottomans were already meddling in the affairs of his neighbour, Wallachia. Here, the story gets personal. Wallachia, the principality just to the south of Moldova, acted as a buffer zone. But by the 1470s, that buffer was failing. The ruler of Wallachia was Radu the Handsome. Radu was Stephen's cousin, but they were very different men. Radu had grown up as a hostage in the Ottoman court. He had known the Sultan since they were boys. He was culturally Ottoman, loyal to the Porte, and willing to let Wallachia serve as a forward base for Turkish expansion. For Stephen, this was intolerable. A pro-Ottoman Wallachia meant the enemy was right on his doorstep, able to strike at his southern flank whenever they chose. In November 1473, Stephen made his move. It was a calculated act of aggression. He took his army across the Milkov River, the border into Wallachia. He wasn't there to conquer the country for himself. He was there to force a regime change. He marched on Bucharest, defeated his cousin, and placed his own candidate, a man named Bârlad the Elder, on the Wallachian throne. This wasn't just a border skirmish. This was a direct challenge to the Sultan's authority. By replacing an Ottoman puppet with a Moldovan ally, Stephen was trying to push the Ottoman frontier back away from his own lands. He was trying to build a coalition, a wall of Christian states that could hold the line. In Constantinople, Sultan Mehmed watched these events with cold fury. Mehmed was not a man who tolerated defiance. To him, Stephen was not a rival king, he was a disobedient vassal, a local governor who had forgotten his place. The insult of the unpaid gold was bad enough, but the strategic threat was unacceptable. By meddling in Wallachia, Stephen was threatening the Sultan's control over the Danube line and the lucrative trade routes of the Black Sea. If Moldova was allowed to rebel, other subject states might get the same idea. The Sultan's response was swift and terrifying. He did not send a diplomat, he sent his best general. Süleyman Pasha was a eunuch general of the Ottoman court, a man hardened by years of brutal campaigning. He was currently bogged down in a siege in Albania, fighting the Venetians, but Mehmed ordered him to break off the attack. His orders were simple: march north, cross the frozen Danube, and punish the Moldovan Prince. Süleyman gathered a massive force. It was an imperial army, designed not just to defeat an enemy, but to crush a civilization. It included the elite Janissaries, the Sultan's personal shock troops, fanatically loyal and heavily armed. It included heavy cavalry and the feared light raiders known as a Kinji. In the winter of 1474, reports began to reach Stephen at his court in Suceava. The gold he had kept in his treasury would now have to be spent on steel. The Ottomans weren't just sending a raiding party to scold him, they were sending an invasion force to erase him. As the Ottomans gathered south of the Danube, Stephen unleashed his communication network. He sent out couriers who rode furiously through the deep valleys and dense forests of Moldova. Their arrival triggered a cascade of signals. Church bells began to ring in remote villages. Beacons were lit on hilltops, passing the message of fire from one peak to the next. The message was simple: the great army was summoned. To see how a tiny principality with a population of perhaps only 250,000 people could hope to resist an empire that spanned 3 continents, we have to look at the unique way Moldovan society was built. It was a state designed for war. In most of medieval Europe, fighting was the job of the nobility. Knights fought. Peasants farmed. If you armed the peasants, you risked a rebellion. But Stephen didn't have the luxury of fear. He needed numbers. Stephen activated a legal obligation that bound his people to the land. In Moldova, the peasantry was largely free, not serfs owned by a master. But this freedom came with a heavy price tag. Their right to hold land was directly tied to their obligation to fight for it. When the Voivode called, every able-bodied man had to answer. This wasn't a disorderly mob pitching pitchforks against swords. It was a system of rigid, terrifying discipline. Stephen held annual inspections of his peasant levies. If a man showed up without a sword, a bow, and a full quiver of arrows, he didn't just get a fine, he was beheaded on the spot. This brutality ensured that when the bells rang in 1474, Stephen could pull between 40,000 and 60,000 men out of the fields and forests. In a nation of 250,000 souls, that is a staggering percentage, nearly every adult male capable of holding a weapon. At the core of this mass of peasant infantry was the professional steel. Stephen surrounded himself with a standing army of elite cavalry called curtini, or courtiers. These were the lesser landowners, men who lived by the sword and served directly in the prince's retinue. Alongside them marched a personal guard of 3,000 hand-picked troops, heavily armed professionals who answered only to Stephen. The command structure that held this mix of farmers and killers together relied on the wardens. These were the district governors, appointed by Stephen to run the network of stone fortresses that anchored the country's defences. In peacetime, a warden was an administrator and judge. In war, he was a general, gathering the local levies at his castle and marching them to the concentration point. By January 1475, Stephen had achieved the impossible. He had assembled an army that nearly matched the Ottoman invaders in raw numbers. But numbers are not the same as combat power. Stephen looked at his forces. He saw brave men fighting for their own land, their own families, and their own souls. But he also saw farmers in wool coats holding homemade bows. Across the river, Suleyman Pasha was bringing the Janissaries, professional soldiers trained from boyhood to be the finest infantry in the world. He was bringing heavy cavalry and field artillery. Stephen knew that his army of peasants, brave as they were, could not stand toe-to-toe with the professional war machine of Suleyman Pasha on open ground. If the Ottomans were allowed to fight a conventional war, Moldova would fall in a week. So Stephen decided to change the parameters of the conflict. He ordered a retreat, but it was a fighting retreat of a terrible kind. He implemented a strategy of absolute desolation. Now, the average Moldovan villagers were ordered to take a torch to their own life's work. They burned their farmhouses. They set fire to the fields where the winter wheat might be stored. They smashed their own food stocks. It was an act of extreme ruthlessness. Stephen was gambling the survival of his people on the destruction of their livelihood. He was betting that the Moldovans could survive the hunger and the cold better than the invaders could. It is a testament to his authority and the people's fear of the Turks that they obeyed. The entire population of the southern districts packed what they could carry and vanished into the deep forests and the mountains, leaving nothing behind but charred wood and empty wells. As Suleyman Pasha and his massive army crossed the frozen Danube and pushed north, they didn't find the villages they expected. They didn't find barns full of winter grain or cellars stocked with wine. They found ash. The invasion turned into a nightmare. An army of that size, tens of thousands of men, thousands of horses, camels and camp followers, is like a giant beast. It needs to eat every single day. Usually an invading army feeds itself by foraging, which is a polite word for stealing food from the locals, but there was nothing to steal. As they marched deeper into Moldova, the Ottomans found themselves walking through a wasteland. The Moldovan road, usually a bustling artery of trade connecting the Black Sea to the north, became a corridor of starvation. The soldiers began to weaken. Their immune systems crashed. Disease began to spread through the ranks, doing the work that Moldovan arrows hadn't yet started. Then the weather turned against them. It was January. The Moldovan winter is unforgiving in a normal year, but 1475 was exceptional. The temperature plummeted. Heavy snows began to fall, clogging the roads and freezing the mud. The Ottomans, miserable, starving and shivering in the howling wind, were harassed constantly. Stephen's light cavalry would strike at their foraging parties, killing a few men, disrupting their sleep, and then vanishing back into the white mist. Suleyman Pasha was now in a bind. He couldn't stop, or his army would freeze and starve to death in the open. He couldn't retreat because the Sultan did not forgive failure. He had to move forward. He had to find the Moldovan army, force a battle, crush them, and take their supplies. Stephen knew this. He knew the Ottomans were desperate for a fight, just to end the misery of the march. So he offered them a path. He didn't block the road. He guided them. He funneled the shivering, hungry, angry Ottoman mass toward a specific geographical location. It was a place where the ground was low and soft, where the winter fog clung to the earth, and where the sheer size of the Ottoman army would become a curse rather than a blessing. The invaders, blinded by the weather and driven by hunger, marched straight into the swampy Bârlad Valley at Vaslui. To the Ottoman commanders, this valley looked like a highway to victory. It was a direct route toward the centre of Moldovan power. But to Stephen, who knew every curve of the riverbank and every dip in the elevation, this valley was a weapon. Geography is often described as the stage of war, but here the geography was not just the stage, it was the primary actor. The Bârlad River winds through a valley that is flanked by wooded hills. In the height of summer, the valley floor is a lush green meadow, but in the winter of 1475, during a thaw followed by a freeze, it was a treacherous semi-frozen marsh. Suleiman Pasha's army was estimated to number between 60,000 and 120,000 men. An army of that size relies on width. To be effective, it needs to spread out, to extend its line so that its superior numbers can envelop the smaller enemy force. Stephen understood that he could not defeat the Ottomans if they were allowed to deploy their full width. He had to turn their greatest strength, their numbers, into their greatest weakness. He had to turn an army into a crowd. He chose a spot near the town of Vaslui, where the valley narrowed significantly. This was not a random location. Vaslui was one of Stephen's key residences. Excavations have revealed a princely court there, decorated with luxurious enamelled tiles depicting courtly life and military retinues. Stephen had lived here. He knew that when the snow melted or the river rose, the valley floor turned into a glue-like mud that could suck a warhorse down to its belly. Here, the hills pressed in on the river, creating a natural bottleneck. Stephen ordered his men to enhance the terrain. They didn't just wait for the enemy. They engineered the battlefield. The Moldovans dug ditches and raised earth mounds. They felled trees and sharpened the trunks, creating palisades that blocked easy movement. These were not the stone walls of a fortress, which could be battered down by the Sultan's heavy siege guns. These were low, invisible obstacles hidden by the mist and the mud. The plan was a classic example of asymmetric warfare. Stephen placed his main force at the narrowest point of the funnel. By blocking the exit, he ensured that as the Ottoman vanguard made contact, the thousands of troops behind them would keep pushing forward, compressing the front line into a chaotic, suffocating mass. Crucially, the swampy ground neutralized the Ottoman heavy cavalry. The Sipahis, the armoured knights of the east, needed firm ground to charge. In the Bârlad Valley, their horses would struggle for footing, sliding on the ice and sinking into the bog. As the Ottoman army trudged into the valley on January 10th, they were exhausted from the scorched earth march. They were hungry, and now they were crowded. The narrow terrain forced them to march in a dense column, shoulder to shoulder, horse to horse. They couldn't see the Moldovan positions in the distance. They couldn't see the ditches hidden in the snow. They were walking into a kill box, a geographical container designed to hold them in place while they were destroyed, but a trap is useless if the prey sees it closing. For Stephen's plan to work, he needed one more element to complete the encirclement. He needed to blind them completely. And as the morning broke, the sky over Moldova answered him. In the morning, the sun did not truly rise over the Bârlad Valley. Instead, the heavy, low-hanging clouds that had shadowed the Ottoman march finally descended to the earth. A dense, wet fog rolled off the marshlands, mixing with driving snow. In military history, we often speak of the fog of war as a metaphor for confusion, for the lack of reliable information that plagues a commander in the heat of battle. But at Vaslui, the fog was not a metaphor. It was a physical wall. For Suleiman Pasha, this weather was catastrophic. The Ottoman military machine relied on coordination. Officers used visual signals, flags, horsetail standards, and hand motions to direct the movement of thousands of men. The elite cavalry needed to see the terrain to know where to charge. The archers needed to see their targets to loose their volleys. But as the Ottoman vanguard pushed deeper into the valley, the world shrank to a radius of a few yards. A soldier could see the man marching in front of him, and perhaps the man to his left. But beyond that there was only the swirling grey mist. The valley floor, already narrowed by the hills, seemed to disappear entirely. The Ottomans could not see the wooded slopes rising on either side of them. They could not see the end of the valley where Stephen's army waited. They were marching blind. This blindness fundamentally changed the mechanics of the engagement. Usually an invading army would send out scouts to probe the enemy's lines. They would identify the weak points, the flanks, and the safe ground. But the scouts who rode ahead simply vanished into the whiteout. If they found the enemy, they died before they could report back. If they found nothing, they returned with no useful intelligence. Suleiman Pasha was forced to make a fatal assumption. Because he could not see the Moldovan army, and because he had faced only retreating peasants for weeks, he assumed the resistance ahead would be light. He assumed he was chasing a fleeing enemy, not walking into a fortified position. He ordered his troops to press forward, to keep moving through the mud and the snow, hoping to punch through whatever rearguard Stephen had left behind. The weather also levelled the playing field psychologically. The Ottoman soldier was used to the sight of his own massive army, the endless rows of banners and the shining armour of the cavalry, to instill fear in the enemy and confidence in himself. In the fog, that visual dominance was gone. The Ottoman army was no longer a single terrifying entity. It was just a collection of cold, wet, isolated men, stumbling over frozen routes and sinking into the marsh. Hidden within the fog, the Moldovan army was perfectly still. Stephen had positioned his main infantry force across the narrowest part of the valley, blocking the exit. He had not just placed men in front of the Ottomans, he had placed them on the sides. On the wooded slopes overlooking the valley, concealed by the trees and the thick mist, Stephen had positioned his archers and early musketeers. Alongside them, he placed artillery. These were small field pieces, mobile enough to be dragged by oxen through the forests and positioned on the muddy ridges overlooking the valley. Placing artillery is an art. If you put them in front of the enemy, you can hit the first rank, but the balls will stop there. If you put them on the sides, aiming across the enemy's path, you create a kill zone where every shot ploughs through multiple ranks of men. This is called enfilade fire. The Ottomans had no idea they were walking toward a solid wall of shields and spears. They could not see the ditches Stephen had dug, nor the artillery positioned on the surrounding hills. The trap was set, the door was locked, and now the target was perfectly positioned. For a long moment, the only sound in the Bârlad Valley was the squelch of thousands of boots in the mud and the nervous whinnying of horses. The fog was a thick white blanket that muffled everything. The Ottoman soldiers were marching into a void. High on the wooded slopes, hidden by the trees and the mist, Stephen waited. He was looking down at a grey ocean of fog that hid the most powerful army in the world. He knew exactly where they were, not because he could see them, but because the geography gave them no other choice. He had squeezed them into a narrow corridor of marshland. Now he was about to turn that corridor into a shooting gallery. At the signal, perhaps a single trumpet blast that cut through the damp air, the Moldovan gunners touched their linstocks to the touch-holes. The silence of the valley was shattered by a rolling thunder that didn't stop. Dozens of bronze cannons roared from the tree line. Because of the fog, the Ottomans didn't see the muzzle flashes. They just heard the explosion, and then, a split second later, felt the impact. Iron cannonballs screamed out of the mist. In 1475, artillery shells didn't explode on contact. They were solid spheres of iron or stone. When fired into a dense crowd, they acted like bowling balls crashing into pins. A single shot could tear through 10 or 20 men, shearing off limbs and smashing armour before burying itself in the mud. The effect on the Ottoman column was instant and horrific. The compression of the army, which had been an annoyance during the march, now became a death sentence. The soldiers were packed so tightly together that they couldn't dodge. When a horse went down, thrashing in the freezing water, it tripped the men around it. When a gap opened in the lines from a cannonball strike, the pressure of the marching column behind instantly filled it with fresh bodies, providing new targets for the Moldovan gunners. Panic began to ripple through the Ottoman ranks. This wasn't a battle. It was an industrial slaughter. The psychological terror was worse than the physical damage. The Ottomans were the masters of artillery. They were used to being the ones with the big guns. Now they were on the receiving end, taking fire from an invisible enemy. They tried to return fire, but they had no targets. Their archers loosed arrows blindly into the fog, hitting nothing but trees. Their own heavy cannons were stuck in the mud at the rear of the column, useless. Suleiman Pasha, somewhere in that chaotic mass, tried to maintain order. But commands are useless when they can't be heard over the roar of gunpowder and the screams of the dying. The disciplined formations of the Janissaries began to fray. The cavalry, the pride of the East, became a liability as terrified horses threw their riders and trampled their own infantry in an attempt to escape the noise. Stephen watched the chaos unfold, listening as the sound of the enemy army shifted, from the rhythmic tramp of marching feet to the discordant roar of panic. The artillery had done its work. The Ottoman formation, normally a solid block of discipline, had dissolved into a loose, confused mob. Yet the bombardment was only the hammer, not the killing blow. To destroy the enemy, Stephen needed to close in, to transform a technological ambush into a brutal, physical rout. When the bronze guns finally fell silent on the wooded slopes, a strange, ringing emptiness filled the Bârlad Valley. The air was thick with the sulphurous stench of black powder, mixing with the metallic tang of blood and the damp, freezing rot of the marsh. Down in the kill box, the Ottoman army was a wounded animal writhing in the mud, but it was not dead. We have to remember the quality of the men trapped in that valley. These were the Janissaries and the Sipahis, veterans who had marched across Anatolia and the Balkans, men who believed they were the invincible sword of God. Even amidst the carnage of the cannon fire, their training kicked in. Officers screamed through the smoke, their voices cracking with desperation, trying to slap the confused lines back into formation. They locked their shields. They pointed their spears outward into the fog. They prepared to die hard. If Stephen gave them an hour, even 30 minutes to catch their breath, the sheer weight of their numbers would reassert itself. They would push up the slopes, and they would slaughter the gunners. Stephen, watching from his command post high in the tree line, understood the fragility of this moment. For hours, the main body of the Moldovan army had been lying in the freezing wet woods, completely silent. The vast majority were the free peasants who had burned their own farms weeks ago. They had slaughtered their own livestock to starve the Turks. They were cold, hungry, and filled with a terrifying, holy rage. They had listened to the cannons roar. They had heard the screams of the Turks dying in the mud. Every instinct in their bodies screamed at them to rush in, to hack and slash, to end it. But they hadn't moved. They had stayed prone in the snow, gripping their axes, scythes and spears, waiting for the prince's word. This discipline was the true miracle of the Moldovan military system, the ability to turn a levy of farmers into a coiled spring that wouldn't snap until the tension was unbearable. Now, with the Ottoman lines wavering in the mist, Stephen decided the tension was high enough. He let the spring go. From the ridgelines, the deep, mournful groan of the busium, the traditional Moldovan althorn used by shepherds, began to echo. It wasn't a trumpet blast. It was a guttural, vibrating roar that seemed to come from the earth itself. It bounced off the hillsides, distorted by the fog, making it sound as if the forests were howling. For the Ottoman soldiers down in the valley, shivering in the mud, that sound was the voice of doom. Then came the human noise. 40,000 men rose from the tree line at once. They didn't march. They poured down the slopes like a landslide of wool and steel. The Ottomans were already fighting three enemies: the suction of the marsh, the biting cold, and the invisible artillery. Now they were hit by a human wave. The Moldovan peasant infantry crashed into the disorganized Ottoman flank with the fury of men who had nothing left to lose but their lives. This was not the chivalric combat of Western Europe. This was brutal, close-quarters butchery. The Moldovans were armed with heavy spiked maces, war axes, and spears. In the tight confines of the press, where the long pikes of the Janissaries couldn't be levelled effectively, these short, heavy weapons were devastating. A mace doesn't need to pierce armour. It just needs to smash the bone underneath. The Ottoman front line crumpled instantly. Simultaneously, Stephen unleashed the iron fist of his army, the Curtini. These were the Boyar cavalry, the heavy hitters of the Moldovan state. Usually sending heavy cavalry into a swamp is a recipe for disaster. But Stephen knew this terrain. He knew where the ridges of firm ground lay beneath the snow. He guided his elite squadrons like a spear point into the softest part of the Ottoman formation. The Catini didn't need to execute a high-speed gallop. The sheer kinetic energy of thousands of armoured horses pushing into a compressed crowd was enough. They acted like a wedge, splitting the Ottoman mass apart. The vaunted Ottoman discipline dissolved. The Akinji light cavalry were pulled off their horses and cut down in the sludge. Their composite bows were useless because the damp air had slackened the strings, and the glue was coming undone in the wet snow. They were defenceless. Suleiman Pasha was somewhere in that chaotic mass. We can imagine his panic. An imperial army relies on a chain of command, flags, drums, runners. But the chain was broken. He couldn't see his wings. His runners were dead or lost in the fog. He was trying to command 100,000 men who had suddenly become 100,000 isolated, terrified individuals. The battle ceased to be a contest of tactics and became a contest of will. And the Ottoman will was breaking. It was a psychological cascade. It started at the back of the Ottoman line. Soldiers who hadn't yet been engaged saw the slaughter happening in front of them. They saw the mud turning red. They felt the cold seeping into their bones. And they realised that there was no glory to be had here. Only a wet, anonymous death in a dark forest at the edge of the world. The first man threw down his shield, then 10, then 100. The sound of the battle changed. It shifted from the rhythmic clash of steel to the discordant, high-pitched roar of total panic. The Ottoman formations shattered. The great imperial standards, the horsetails that represented the Sultan's authority, fell into the muck and were trampled by thousands of boots. The Ottoman soldiers stopped trying to fight and started trying to survive. They turned south, toward the Danube, desperate to escape the trap that Stephen had closed around them. The Battle of Vaslui was technically over, but for Stephen, the work wasn't finished. A wounded enemy is dangerous, a destroyed enemy is not. He couldn't just let them leave. He had to make sure they never came back. So, as the sun began to set on that freezing January afternoon, Stephen did not order his men to rest. He ordered the hunt. He unleashed his light cavalry. These were the swift, lightly armoured horsemen who had spent the battle waiting for this exact moment. They surged forward into the fog, not to fight a battle, but to harvest a victory. What followed was a 3-day running nightmare for the invading force. The Ottoman army was trying to flee south, back towards the safety of the Danube River. But they were moving through a landscape that Stephen had already turned into a weapon. This was the same scorched earth territory they had marched through weeks earlier, a wasteland stripped of food, shelter, and comfort. The weather, which had blinded them during the battle, now froze them in their flight. The temperature dropped as night fell. The roads, churned into a slurry of mud and ice by the passage of 2 great armies, became treacherous slides. For the fleeing Ottoman soldier there was no sanctuary. If he stayed on the main road, he was part of a slow-moving, terrified herd, an easy target for the Moldovan sabres hacking at the rear of the column. If he broke away into the forest to hide, he faced the local peasantry waiting in the dark with axes and scythes. The road south became littered with the debris of an empire. Expensive tents were left bundled in the mud. Camels, brought all the way from Anatolia to carry supplies, were cut loose or slaughtered for a quick meal by starving fugitives. Most significantly, the Ottomans abandoned their artillery. The great bronze guns, symbols of the Sultan's modern military might, were left sinking into the Moldovan sludge. Stephen's forces were relentless. For 3 days and 3 nights they maintained the pressure. This was a strategic calculation by Stephen. He understood that exhaustion is as lethal as a sword. By forcing the Ottomans to keep running, denying them even an hour of sleep or a moment to light a fire, he let the winter do the killing for him. Thousands of invaders succumbed not to combat, but to the cold. They collapsed on the roadside, their energy spent, and were buried by the falling snow. The Moldovan road became a corridor of corpses. The climax of this catastrophe occurred at the banks of the Danube. The river was the finish line. Across that wide, freezing water lay Ottoman territory, safety and survival. As the remnants of Süleyman Pasha's army piled up on the northern bank, searching for boats or trying to cross the ice, the Moldovan pursuit caught up with them. The scenes at the riverbank were apocalyptic. Men, maddened by fear, tried to swim the freezing waters and were swept away by the current. Overcrowded boats capsized. Those who couldn't cross turned to fight with the desperation of the doomed, but they were cut down by the fresh, victorious Moldovan cavalry. By the time the survivors stumbled onto the southern bank, the Grand Army of the Porte had effectively ceased to exist. Chronicles and reports from the time speak of staggering losses, tens of thousands dead. The exact numbers are always debated by historians, but the scale of the destruction is not. A force that had entered Moldova as a conquering juggernaut had returned as a scattered, broken rabble. Stephen had achieved absolute clearance. He had scrubbed his land clean of the invader. Back at Vaslui, as the pursuit wound down, the scale of the spoils became apparent. It wasn't just the abandoned cannons. Stephen's men captured dozens of Ottoman standards. They would soon be sent as trophies to the courts of Europe. They captured thousands of prisoners, including high-ranking pashas and generals. For Stephen, standing amidst the wreckage of the greatest army in the world, the emotions must have been complex. There was the undeniable elation of victory. He had vindicated his refusal to pay the tribute. He had proven that his small Christian principality could stand against the Islamic superpower. But Stephen was a realist, not a romantic. Süleyman Pasha, the defeated general, was merely a servant. The master, Sultan Mehmed II, was still in Constantinople, and Mehmed was not a man who forgave humiliation. The Battle of Vaslui was a tactical masterpiece, but it was a provocation. Stephen had just slapped the face of the most powerful ruler on earth. As the adrenaline of the chase faded and the silence of winter returned to the Moldovan forests, a cold certainty settled over the Voivode. The Ottomans would return, and next time they wouldn't send a general. The Sultan would come himself. Stephen realised that his military victory, absolute as it seemed, had bought him time, but it had not bought him safety. To survive the storm that was gathering on the horizon, he would need more than just brave peasants and clever traps. He would need the rest of Christendom to stop fighting each other and stand with him at the gate. On January 25th, 1475, just 2 weeks after the battle, Stephen dictated a letter. It was sent to the Christian princes of Europe, to the King of Hungary, the King of Poland, and the Pope in Rome. In this document, Stephen did not beg for help. He offered a transaction. He framed his small, vulnerable state not as a beggar at the feast, but as the shield that protected the table. He described Moldova as the gateway to all Christendom. This wasn't just poetic language. It was a precise geographical argument. Stephen was pointing out a hard strategic reality. If Moldova fell, the Ottoman Empire would control the Black Sea commercial routes and have a clear, flat road into the Kingdom of Poland and the Kingdom of Hungary. The gate was currently shut, Stephen argued, but the hinges were straining. If the Christian powers wanted to keep their own land safe, they didn't need to fight a war on their own borders. They just needed to help Stephen hold the line on his. The letter was a masterstroke of legitimacy. It transformed Stephen from a rebellious vassal of the Turks into the champion of Europe. The response from the West was immediate and effusive. The victory at Vaslui had sent shockwaves through the courts of Europe. It was the first time a major Ottoman field army had been destroyed in decades. Pope Sixtus IV wrote back, showering Stephen with praise. He bestowed upon the Moldovan Prince the title the Athlete of Christ. He wrote that Stephen's deeds had made his name famous across the world, and that he enjoyed the unanimous appreciation of the faithful. Stephen had the glory, he had the title, he had the moral high ground. But he looked at the horizon, and he realised he had received everything except what he actually asked for. The kings of Poland and Hungary sent congratulations, but they did not send armies. The Pope sent blessings, but he did not send gold. The great coalition that Stephen had hoped to build, a united Christian front to permanently block the Ottoman advance, failed to materialise. The European powers were too busy fighting each other, paralysed by their own rivalries, to secure the gate that Stephen was guarding. This diplomatic failure had a terrifying consequence. In Constantinople, Sultan Mehmed was done with proxies. The defeat of his general at Vaslui was a personal insult to the man who called himself the king of the world. The Sultan decided that the Moldovan problem would no longer be handled by subordinates. He began to gather a new army, larger than the first, and this time he would lead it himself. The snows of 1475 eventually melted. The bodies in the Bârlad Valley were buried, and the grass grew back. And if we look at a map 30 years later, we might ask, did the victory at Vaslui actually matter? Because the Ottomans did come back. Sultan Mehmed returned the very next summer, in 1476. He burned the capital at Suceava and defeated Stephen in the open field at Războieni. Eventually the great ports of the Black Sea, Chilia and Cetatea Alba, fell to the Turks, and Moldova was forced to pay the tribute once again. But looking at the map misses the point. Stephen III didn't fight to conquer the world. He fought to keep his corner of it from disappearing. For 47 years, a lifetime in the Middle Ages, he held the gate. He played a deadly game of chess between the great powers of Hungary, Poland and the Ottoman Empire, using every tool he had, the landscape, the peasant army and sheer political will. Vaslui proved that the Ottoman war machine was not invincible. It shattered the psychological paralysis that had gripped Europe since the fall of Constantinople. It created a reservoir of pride and legitimacy that a small nation has drawn from for half a millennium. Without Vaslui, without that winter of defiance, it is very possible that Moldova would have been simply absorbed, turned into a directly ruled Ottoman province like parts of Hungary or Bulgaria. The local aristocracy might have been liquidated, the churches turned into mosques, the specific cultural DNA of the region erased. Instead, Stephen negotiated a survival. He paid the tribute, but he kept his throne, his army, and his church. He preserved the internal autonomy of his country. That survival allowed the culture to incubate, to develop, and eventually to re-emerge in the modern world. Nowadays, we live in an age where we often measure success by total victory, unconditional surrender, total domination. Stephen offers a different kind of lesson. He teaches us about the victory of endurance. He teaches us that sometimes winning means simply refusing to disappear. Today, if you visit the monastery at Putna, you can still see his tomb. He isn't remembered just as a warrior who killed 100,000 men in the mud. He is remembered as the builder who raised churches and monasteries, stone anchors that held his culture in place while the storms of history raged around them. In the end, he took a small, vulnerable state and turned it into a fortress of identity that outlasted the empires that tried to crush it. And with that, the story of the Battle of Vaslui comes to an end here. Before we close, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think Stephen's gamble was worth the cost? Was the devastation of his own land, the scorched earth, and the decades of constant war a price worth paying for that survival? Or was he a man driven by pride who dragged his people into a conflict they couldn't ultimately win? If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most underrated conflicts, please hit that subscribe button. There are many more forgotten battles and stubborn leaders waiting in the archives, and I'd like to explore them with you. Until next time, I hope you have a peaceful day.